Today's video is going to be an interesting one because I'm going to talk about something that I haven't seen many people talk about, and that is answering the question, can we produce Dolby Atmos on any DAW? Not just the ones that are known to be Dolby Atmos capable, such as Pro Tools, Cubase, Nuendo, DaVinci Resolve Fairlight, Logic, or maybe even Ableton. But what if you're working with Bitwig? What if you're working with Studio One? What if you're working with any of the other digital audio workstations? Can you still produce Dolby Atmos content? And the answer to that question is yes, you can. And that's what we're going to talk about today. But first of all, hello everybody. In case you're new here, my name is Michael Wagner. I teach at the Antoinette Westphal College of Media Arts and Design at Drexel University in Philadelphia. And on this channel, I talk about digital media, game design, and spatial audio. And if any of those topics interest you, I invite you to subscribe or join my Discord community. Invite link is in the description below. And as always, also please don't forget to press the like button. Before I go any further, I need to point out that there's one limitation to what I'm going to do today, and that limitation is that we need the Dolby Atmos production suite. I'm going to leave a link in the description below, and that production suite is only available for Mac operating systems. So if you are on a Windows system, you're a little bit out of luck. Now, you could technically do the same things with the Dolby Atmos Mastering Suite, and the Mastering Suite is available for Windows as well. However, be aware that the Mastering Suite is significantly more expensive and also significantly more complicated to set up, simply because it requires a two-computer setup with a fairly complex audio routing system from one machine to the other. So it's quite expensive, but if you're a Windows maximalist and you don't like to use Mac OS at all, you can do the same things as well. It's just more expensive and more complex to set up. But for the purpose of this video, I'm going to work with the Mac operating system today, and I'm going to stay with the Dolby Atmos production suite. Now, be aware that you'll need the latest version of the Dolby Atmos production suite, which at the time of recording was version 3.7.3. If you have an earlier version, go to the Dolby Professional site and update your version, because there are some things that they changed from 3.5 to 3.7 that are important for us, especially if you're working on an Apple Silicon Mac. Now, there's one final comment I would like to make, and that is also a response to one of the comments that I got in a previous video where I talked about Dolby Atmos production in Ableton Live. And that was the comment that why do we even bother with a regular digital audio workstation? You know, kind of if you are Dolby Atmos producer, you're most likely doing post-production. And if you're doing post-production, wouldn't it be much more natural to use a digital audio workstation that is designed to be used for post-production, such as DaVinci Resolve Fairlight or Nuendo or Pro Tools? Now, the reason why I think it's still important to talk about how to use a regular digital audio workstation for Dolby Atmos production is that many music producers simply might want to turn their music productions into Dolby Atmos productions. And for that, they don't want to kind of learn a completely new DAW. So if you're already working with Bitwig, if you're already working with Studio One, the question still is, can I use what I already have and turn that into Dolby Atmos? And that's essentially why I decided to make this video today. So why this video is probably going to be most useful for Studio One users. Anything that we're going to do today can be easily translated into any other digital audio workstation. So if you're working with Bitwig, or if you're working with Waveform, or if you're working with Reaper, or if you're working with any other digital audio workstation, you should still be able to do exactly the same things that we're going to do here with Studio One in your digital audio workstation and achieve exactly the same results. With that being said, let's get right into it. Now, there's one final comment I need to make, and that is if you're working on an Apple Silicon Mac, you might need to run your digital audio workstation in Rosetta mode. And the reason for that is that, at least at the time of this recording, one of the plugins that comes with the Dolby Atmos production suite is not yet native to Apple Silicon. So in order for everything to work correctly, you need to run your digital audio workstation in Rosetta mode. But with that out of the way, we can finally get to work. And the way I'm going to do this today is, as I always do, with a very, very simple project. And I'm going to use the same loops that I used in the Ableton video. So if you're a long-time follower of my videos, you already know what I'm going to kind of use here. It's a little set of loops, or two loops to be correct, that come with the Elastic demo bank. And I like to use them, quite frankly, because they are very flexible in terms of the licensing. But let's just have a brief listen on what we have here. It's essentially a little synth and a little keys loop. So a little synth here. The keys come in. And this is essentially what we're going to get started with. Now, what we want to do is we want to turn that into a Dolby Atmos project. And that essentially means that what we're going to do is we're going to turn these two tracks into objects in Dolby Atmos. And then we're going to do something that might seem a little weird because Studio One is a stereo-only DAW. What we're going to do is we're also going to add a 7.1.2 Atmos bed, and we're going to use this bed as a reverb. Now, the reason you would like to use a bed for the reverb is simply because if you are baking the reverb onto the actual track and you're using that track for an object, the object is localized, meaning that has a very, very exact position in three-dimensional space. And if you put the reverb onto that object, that reverb is also in that space. But sometimes we just want the reverb to kind of be all around us, and for that, essentially, we need a bed. So we're going to also add a 7.1.2 bed in Studio One. And once again, we're going to use a little trick for that because technically, Studio One can't really do 7.1.2. We will see how we're going to do that. So these are essentially the two things that we're going to do today. Now, the first thing, obviously, we need to start the Dolby Atmos Renderer. So let's just start that up. I have a lot of things here. So that's here we have the renderer, and let's start up the renderer here. Now, the Dolby Atmos Renderer, if you're starting it up, make sure that the settings for the output are correct. So if we go into the preferences, we want to make sure that the input device is the Dolby Atmos, the Dolby Audio Bridge. And the output device, for me personally, that's here, it's kind of external headphones, and that's simply because that's the way I've set up the audio here. Whatever audio interface you're using, so this is actually the actual output device. Also, remember the LTC input channel, we will need that later. This is channel number 129. This is the one channel that we're going to use in order to take in timecode information, and also remember the frame rate. The frame rate for us is not going to make a whole lot of difference. We're working with a music-only DAW, so we are not really doing any video stuff here, so you can essentially change that to anything that you want, but we need to, in our Studio One session, also set the frame rate correctly, so we just need to make sure that these frame rates match. I'm not going to change that, I'm not going to bother, so it's 33.976 frames per second. With that being said, let's get into Studio One and let's set up the routing so that we can actually route the audio into the Dolby Atmos Renderer. And for that, we're going to go into the preferences of Studio One. And once again, if you're working with a different digital audio workstation, just do the same things in your digital audio workstation that I'm doing here in Studio One. So what we want to do is we want to set the playback device to be the Dolby Audio Bridge. And that essentially makes sure that the audio is routed from your digital audio workstation into the Dolby Atmos Renderer. So we're going to set OK here. Now, if I'm now playing that, I should already hear sound, because what's happening now is that the audio is sent into the Dolby Audio Bridge, and the Dolby Audio Bridge is routed into the Dolby Atmos Renderer, and the Dolby Atmos Renderer then does something with it. At the moment, it doesn't really much, but it's sort of already receiving that, and it's forwarding that to the to my audio interface. In my particular case, it's sort of the external headphones. So let's just see if we hear stuff. And yes, I hear, and if I switch to the Dolby Atmos Renderer, I already see that sort of the audio signal is coming in at channels 1 and 2, which are the left and the right channel of the Dolby Atmos bed. So once again, the first 10 channels here are the bed channels, and what we're going to do is we're going to use the remaining channels for Dolby Atmos objects. So let's stop that again. So we already set up the routing. So the first important thing now is that we need to route these two tracks into objects in the Dolby Atmos Renderer. And the way to do that is to insert the Dolby Atmos Music Panner onto those tracks. And these Dolby Atmos Music Panners will route the meta information of those tracks into the Dolby Atmos renderer. So let's go into the inserts, and I'm going to do that for both tracks at the same time, just to save a little bit of time. So we're going to search for Dolby, and we have the Dolby Atmos Music Panner. So let's put that in here. The first, there are a couple of things that we need to set here. Well, first of all, let's make sure that the Dolby Atmos renderer is set to be localhost, which essentially means it is local. It's sending it locally. Then the second thing is we need to select what object pair we're going to use. And we're going to start with 11 and 12. That's essentially what we're going to do. And then we're going to do the same thing for the second track. And we're going to also add a Dolby Atmos music panner. Here we are. And in this case, we're going to choose 13 and 14. Now, 11, 12 are now grayed out because the system knows I already used them, so I can't use the object channels twice. So I'm going to use the next available ones, which are 13 and 14. Now, if you have more than 2 tracks, obviously you would kind of continue doing that for each individual track and would just kind of add music panners that way and add sort of objects into the Dolby Atmos renderer. Now, if I'm now playing that, I actually haven't really changed anything yet. And the reason for that is because the Dolby Atmos panner only sends the meta information into the object. So we see that the Dolby Atmos renderer already knows that it is expecting information on these channels 11, 12, 13, and 14. But the audio is still routed into 1 and 2. And the reason for that is because I need to route the audio separately from the meta information. So what I'm having right now is that essentially the panning information is already routed into the renderer, but the audio is not yet routed into the renderer. Now, in order to route the audio, what I essentially need to do is I just need to change the routing. So currently these tracks are routed into the main out. And I need to route them into these additional channels that I have in the Dolby Atmos renderer. Now, this is the point where things are a little bit different depending on the digital audio workstation that you're using. In Studio One, what you would do is you would go into the audio input-output setup. And in the input-output setup, we need to look at the outputs here. We would need to add 2 additional stereo outs. So in order to be able to kind of route those into the individual channels here. So let's add 2. So let's call them object. And they are going to be stereo tracks or stereo outs, and let's just add 2 of them to do them once. Once again, how many stereo pairs of objects you have, that's what you would put in here. So let's do that. And what we want to do is we want to route these not standard. It uses kind of the next available channels. That's not what we want to do. Instead of 3, 4, we actually want to have them at 11, 12, and instead of 5, 6 here, we want to have them at 13 and 14. So let's just click that away. And let's instead kind of use the object 1 and route that to 11, 12 and object 2 to 13, 14. And let's click OK. And then essentially what I need to do is I need to change the output, or I need to change the routing from main to object 1 in the first object and from main to object 2 in the second object. And if I'm now playing everything, I should already get the audio information into the Dolby Atmos renderer. So let's just see if that works now. And now I see sort of the 2 tracks. So this is the first object that goes into 11, 12. So I now have the audio coming in, that's sort of this yellow-greenish thing going on here. And the metadata is also coming in, that's kind of shown by the blue circle around that green dot, right? Now, there's one additional thing that I need to do is, and that is I also need to select the, and let me just stop that here. I also need to select the timecode information. And if you followed that video, you might have seen that there's an error here. Let me just kind of start that again. So if I'm going back to the renderer, I actually see here is an external sync error. And that is simply because I'm not yet communicating timecode information from Studio One into the external Dolby Atmos renderer. Now, in order to communicate the timecode information, what I need to do is I need to create a separate track that holds the timecode plugin. And that's actually the one plugin that is not native to Apple Silicon yet, unfortunately. So let's add one additional track, and that's going to be actually let me add that here, add a mono track, and that's actually going to be a mono track. We only need a mono track. You remember that we already looked at the Dolby Atmos Renderer, and we saw that it's expecting to receive the timecode information on channel 129. So what we need to do now is we need to simply create a track here. We need to add the LTC or the timecode plugin. So here we have the Dolby LTC generator. And in the LTC generator, we need to select the frame rate. This was the frame rate. It needs to be the same frame rate that is in the Dolby Atmos Renderer. Once again, doesn't really make any difference which frame rate it is, but it needs to be the same. Now we simply kind of went with the standard, which was 23.9776. So let's choose that one. And we also need to make sure that this is routed into the correct output channel. And that, once again, has to be channel 129. So what we need to do is exactly the same thing that we did with the two objects. So we're going to go into the audio input-output setup. And we're going to add one mono track. And let's call that mono track LTC, just to make sure that we know what we're talking about. And this LTC shouldn't come in at channel 15. We actually want to have that at channel 129. So let's go back there at channel 129 and select that one. Let's click OK. And one final thing is we also need to make sure that it is routed to that output. So we go into the output routing and we select the LTC channel. And now everything should actually work correctly. So let's see again if we see that sync error. And now we see the sync error is gone, so essentially the syncing is done correctly. We're receiving the timecode information through the timecode generator plugin. We're receiving the panning information through the music panner plugins, and we're receiving the audio information through the routing essentially into the external output channels in the Dolby Atmos bridge. Now, at that point, you could already do all kinds of things with Studio One, and as long as you're sticking or kind of only working with objects, you're already fine. But there's one additional step that we want to take, and that additional step is we want to actually also have the bed active. And the reason we want to have the bed active, as I said before, is we might want to use the bed as a reverb channel. And that's simply because if you have reverb to a certain object, we want that reverb, once again, not to be localized at the location of the object. We might want the reverb actually fill the entire room, the entire space. And for that, one way to go about it, I mean, there are many different ways you can do that as well, and I might actually do some additional videos in the future, but the easiest way to go about that is to simply use the Atmos bed. Now, in Studio One, obviously, we don't really have the capabilities of doing an Atmos bed because an Atmos bed has to be 7.1.2. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a little workaround, and the workaround that we're going to use is pretty much the same workaround that we also used in the Ableton video that I showed you. So we're going to simply kind of we're going to create a bus, a reverb bus, and then we're going to split that up into stereo pairs, and we need 5 stereo pairs because there are 10 channels in total. 7.1.2, that's 10 channels. So we're going to create 5 stereo pairs, and we're going to route the stereo pairs then into the Dolby Atmos Renderer. So it's essentially working almost identical to the way we did it in Ableton, almost identical. We'll see there's a little bit of a difference there. So let's add a 10-channel reverb bus to our little project. And the first thing I'm going to do in order to achieve that is simply add a bus to our setup. So let's just add a bus channel here. And let's give that bus channel a name. So let's call that reverb. And since I'm already added, I should probably also change the name of the sub 1 that was actually the LTC channel, just to make sure that we know what we're talking about. So now we have the reverb, and the idea is that we're going to send, kind of some information from the Dolby Atmos tracks, from the object tracks into that reverb track. And then essentially we're going to create that reverb by sending it out to 5 individual stereo pairs that are going to be responsible for the stereo pairs in our 7.1.2 setup. So let's add 5 effects tracks for those stereo pairs. So let's go add 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And we're going to send the information that comes in through the reverb track, and we're going to forward them into those 5 different effects tracks. So what we're going to do is we're going to add in the sense of our reverb these 5 effects tracks: FX1, FX2, FX3, FX4, FX5. I'm going to leave the names. They're actually kind of okay that way. So let's just add a send. So we're going to send that into FX1. We're going to send the second one, the third one, and let's just add all 5 of them. Let me just kind of make that a little larger so that we see everything. And we have the 4th and then the 5th. And now this information that is going to come from our object is going to send into the reverb track. The reverb track then kind of sends it on to our 5 stereo pairs. And all we now really need to do is we need to make sure that the information that is sent on to the Dolby Atmos Renderer is actually a reverb. Now there's one additional complication that we have here. In order to make sure that everything works correctly, we also need to make sure that nothing actually leaves this reverb track. Now in Ableton, what you have is something like a sends only, meaning that we only want to send that information to those 5 stereo pairs, but we actually don't want this signal to be passed on any further. So in Ableton, what you would do is you would simply kind of select instead of the main output, the sends only. In Studio One, we don't have that. And depending on what digital audio workstation you're using, you might or might not have such an option. But what we can do in Studio One, we can actually create a sends only track. So that the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create an additional output that's going to be our sends only output. So let's go back into the audio input-output settings. And what we're going to do is we're going to add a stereo out, and let's call that stereo out sends only. And the way we're going to achieve that is by simply deselecting everything. So currently it automatically kind of wants to send it on to outputs 3 and 4. But what we're going to do is we're simply going to deselect that. And that essentially means it's not really kind of passing that on to any output channel. It thus becomes a sends only. So this is a little trick in case you ever need a sends only option in Studio One. Simply create an output that is not really routed anywhere. And that essentially means that we can now go back into our output routing, and for the main we now can set it to sends only, and that will take care of that. So all the information is now sent on to the reverb. All the information that is passed on to the reverb track is then kind of forwarded to these 5 individual effects tracks. And once again, what we're going to do is we're going to use these 5 individual effects tracks in order to create the stereo pairs of the 7.1.2 reverb. So now in order to kind of make sure that everything is also sending, I also need to make sure that the objects are sending information into the reverb track. So I'm also going to add sends to these 2 objects. So we're going to send that into the reverb, and we're going to send that into the reverb. And that essentially now means that I can kind of send or kind of change the amount of effect that I want to have and send it on to the reverb track. Because of the way we set it up like that, by using a sends only, we can also use the fader of the reverb track as a general kind of control of the volume of the overall reverb. So that actually kind of makes this really nice, and it works pretty much exactly in the same way it would work if you would have an actual 7.1.2 track. So before we complete this setup with including or introducing our actual reverb, let's just see if everything is sent correctly. So if I'm playing that now, I should actually already get information from the objects into our reverb, and it's going to be passed on to these 5 individual effects tracks. And obviously what's happening right now is the objects are passed on to the individual object tracks, but the reverb is still going into 1 and 2. So let's just go back there. And we actually have, I don't know why that happened, but for some reason at some point this switched back to main. So let me just send that back to object 2. And okay, so now we have both objects here. Not quite sure why that happened. It could be that I had to kind of stop the video at some point. I might have changed something. So we have the 2 objects. The audio is sent to the 2 object outputs. There's additional reverb sends that going into the reverb track, and the reverb essentially forwards that into 5 effects tracks, which will be responsible for the 5 stereo pairs that we have in the 7.1.2 setup. So the last thing we now really need to do is, well, actually there are two things we need to do. The first thing is we also need to make sure that these stereo pairs are sent to the correct outputs in our Dolby Atmos Renderer. So we want to have the first channel sent to outputs 1 and 2, the second one to outputs 3 and 4, the third one to outputs 5 and 6, and so forth. The way to do that is in exactly the same way we did it for the object. So we're going to go back into the input-output setup. And in the input-output setup, where is the input-output setup? Okay, here we are. What we're going to do is we're going to add 5 bad outputs. So essentially 5 stereo pairs. So let's add them. So they are going to be called bad, and they're going to be stereo, and we want 5 of them. Right? And let's click OK. And now we have these 5 beds. And let's make sure that they are kind of sent to the correct output. So the first one goes to outputs 1 and 2. The second one goes to outputs 3 and 4. The third one goes to outputs 5 and 6. The fourth one to 7 and 8. And the last one goes to 9 and 10. Right? So, and that essentially now completes our output setup. So what we now need to do is we need to simply select the outputs from our drop-downs here. So instead of sending it to main, we're going to send that to output bed 1, the second one to output bed 2, the third one to output bed 3, bed 4. Now, if you are a little bit concerned that this is a lot of setup, we only need to do that once. So that's the nice thing. Once we have that set up, and you can actually create a template for your projects and simply kind of use the template, but it only needs to be created once. So what's happening now is that everything should already be sent into the correct outputs. So we have the 2 objects that are going to be sent into outputs 11 and 12, 13 and 14, and then we have the 5 bed effects that are going to be sent to 1 to 10, and obviously also the LTC channel that's going to be forwarded to 129. And let's see if we get information on all channels. And we now see that essentially there is information coming in at 11, 12, and essentially the second object should come in soon. And we have the 5 effects track that are now routed from 1 to 10. So everything is already routed correctly. So the last thing we need to do is we need to make sure that we are not routing the same information to all these individual channels. We actually want to use a reverb. And for that purpose, we need to find a way in order to integrate a surround sound reverb into a stereo digital audio workstation. So we're going to do the exact same thing that we also did in the Ableton video that I showed a couple of weeks ago. I'm going to leave a link in the description below. I talked a little bit more detail about why we're doing things the way we're doing them there. But what we need to do is we need to kind of wrap a surround sound capable plugin into an additional plugin that can actually handle multi-channel plugins within a stereo DAW. And there are a couple of different plugins that you can use. I usually use Ploak Bidule. I'm going to leave a link in the description below, but there are other options as well. In the Ableton video, I needed to use Ploak Bidule because we needed some special routing capabilities for Ableton. Here, we're actually going to use it in a much simpler way, and that means that most of the plugins, plugin hosts that you can use as plugins that can work with multi-channel should actually work fine. But I'm going to use Ploak Bidule. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to insert Ploak Bidule, and I'm going to simply use the Ploak Bidule FX, and let's do that. Now, let me just zoom that in a little. I don't really need the mixer here, so let me just delete the mixer. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a reverb plugin that is, once again, Dolby Atmos capable. And the one that I'm going to use is I'm going to use HD card. Now, the reason I'm going to use HD card is simply because that's one that I have. These reverbs tend to be very expensive, and I just happen to have that one. But there are a couple of options out there. Many people like Liquid Sonics plugins. Many people like, especially the Cinematic Rooms plugin from Liquid Sonics. But here, once again, whatever you have, whatever floats your boat is fine. I'm going to use HD card, so it comes from Reverb Foundry HD card. And I need the 10 in, 10 out option. So if you are inserting the plugin, my recommendation would be to use the audio unit of a version of that plugin, because that, especially on an Apple, is a little bit more, how should I say, stable, or kind of does things the way you expect it to do. In particular, we need to make sure that we can actually kind of use the surround sound version, so the 10 in and 10 out version of that plugin. So let's put that in. And that should now, and here we are, here we have HD card. Unfortunately, we cannot simply use one Dolby Dual instance and then simply route the individual outputs of HD cards to our individual effects channels. Studio One can't do that. We could do that with Ableton, and you might be able to do that in your digital audio workstation, but in Studio One we can't really do that. So what we need to do is we need to really replicate that plugin, the Dual setup, in every single of our 5 effect channels. So we're going to have actually 5 copies of the very same setup here. That has one disadvantage. If you wanted, for example, change the reverb, the kind of how the reverb actually sounds, you would have to make the same changes 5 times. So it sort of pays off to make sure that when you're starting that setup, to first make sure that all the settings in your reverb is set correctly. And the one thing that we obviously want to have in particular is we want to have the dry wet mix to be completely wet. And then essentially you set up whatever you think is working for you, or whatever you know is working for you. I'm going to leave things the way they are here. I'm not really going to bother with them too much. And then I'm going to route things. And I'm going to route the 2 inputs from Dolby Dual into our HD card. And I'm going to not route anything else, but what I'm going to do first, I'm going to first duplicate that setup to the other 4 effects channels, and then essentially make these connections. So let me go back, let me close that now, and let's just copy that over to the other 4. So we're going to copy that over here. Let me close that, and second one, and then in effects number 4, and the final one. And then I'm simply going to connect the appropriate outputs from our reverb to the outputs of that particular effects channel. So in the first one, I'm going to take the first 2 outputs. In the second one, I'm going to take the second 2 outputs. So I'm going to take output number 3 and 4. I'm going to route that to the outputs of that channel. And then the third one, and 2 more. So we have the number 7 and 8. And then in the final one, we have 9 and 10. And that essentially completes my setup. So I've essentially kind of separated out the stereo pairs from the HD card, and that is also the reason why whenever you change something in the reverb, you would actually have to go back in and kind of do the same changes or apply the same changes to all 5 instances of that plugin. So let's see how that works. So we now have everything set up correctly. The sends are set. The 2 objects are sending information to our reverb bus. The reverb bus is forwarding that information to our 5 stereo pairs. These 5 stereo pairs take to their respective outputs from the reverb and pass them on into the Dolby Atmos Renderer. So everything should actually work perfectly fine. So let's see. And you now see that everything is coming in. We obviously don't have any information on the LFE channel, but everything else is sort of working perfectly fine. And what we can do now is we can sort of change the reverb by simply changing the amount that we are going to send into our reverb channel. And we can also change the overall effect by simply kind of working with the gain of our reverb here. So the last thing I want to show you is how to actually create the Dolby Atmos master file. Now we have set up everything correctly. The Dolby Atmos renderer is working correctly. And all we now want to do is we want to actually export our Dolby Atmos production into something that is actually Dolby Atmos. So we want to create a Dolby Atmos master file. Now, if you've watched my previous videos, you know that this is usually done through the Dolby Atmos renderer. So we can't really bounce the file in the traditional sense. What we actually need to do is we need to record that file with the Dolby Atmos renderer. So let's just have a brief look in how this is done. Now, what we're going to do now is exactly the same that we also did in some of the previous videos where I talked about how to use it in connection with Ableton Live. But kind of just for the sake of completeness, let's just look into that. Now, before I do that, I need to add one more thing. And if you watched the video very, very closely, you might have noticed that somewhere in the recording, I also lost the timecode plugin. So the renderer actually kind of threw an error. Just to keep everything complete, I'm going to add that back in here. So we're going to add that into the thing here. And once again, we're going to set that to 33.976, and that essentially makes sure that everything is running. So let me just see, let me just turn off the looping again, and yeah, everything is okay now. So if you in one of the previous, previously you noticed that there was an error here. This is essentially because I somehow lost the timecode plugin. No harm done. So essentially everything that we need to do now is really to record that master file with the Dolby Atmos renderer. So let me just kind of set the pointer here back. And what we're going to do is we're going to record that as a master file. So the first thing we need to do is we need to go into the file menu and create a new master file. And let's call that master file test. And let's create that. And then essentially what we need to do is we need to press the record enable button, and that will make sure that we will be able to record information. Once again, this only works if the LTC, if the timecode plugin is actually there. So let's press the record button. You can kind of define the in and outs if you want, but we're just going to make that in a very, very simple way. And I'm going to deselect the loop here again, and let's just start that. And this should now start the recording in the Dolby Atmos renderer. Now, obviously, we could move the objects around. Currently, I was a little lazy, and all the objects are just located in left and right speaker positions, but that's fine. And then let's stop. And as soon as we stop that, we now have the master. And what we can do is we can play that either through the renderer or either through the Studio One, the way we did it before, or we can simply play the master file in the renderer. And in order to play the master file in the renderer, we first need to deselect the timecode here, and that will enable here the play button. And now we can play that file in the renderer. And it's essentially the master file that is stored here on my desktop. And you can export that, you can do all kinds with it. You can convert it into different formats. You can convert it into the dreaded MP4 format that is essentially kind of playable on all consumer devices. And that is pretty much it. Now, this is everything I wanted to say today. Thank you again so much for watching. If you have any questions or comments, please use the comment section below. I always like to learn, and I like to kind of converse with you and kind of try to figure out what are the things that kind of interest you so that I know what to do in any future video. Now, I'm not really planning on creating additional videos for additional digital audio workstations. What I showed today in the Studio One, once again, works exactly the same way with any other digital audio workstation. There are some digital audio workstations which are a little bit nicer to work with because they have the capabilities of working with surround. Most noticeably, Reaper would be one of them, but you can also use Digital Performer, for example. That's also surround capable. Not 7.1.2, but at least enough to be usable for Dolby Atmos. So depending on your digital audio workstation, you might need to do the bad trick or not, but it's not going to be that much of a difference otherwise. So I'm not planning on doing additional videos. However, if there's strong interest in me showing you how to do that with a very particular DAW, leave me a comment in the comment section below, and I can certainly do that. I'm a little bit of a DAW collector. I have almost any DAW that's out there, so I'm more than happy to show you how to do that with a different DAW. But with that being said, thank you again for watching. I really appreciate it. And if you liked that video, don't forget to press the like button. And otherwise, see you at the next video.